love to ask for a show of hands of how many of you were ever guilty as a kid of trying to sneak out of the house, but I'd hate for you to set a bad example for your kid. Doesn't matter. Some of you guys are doing that anyways. I see hands being held down. That's hilarious. I have to tell you, I would have started with a story about myself doing it, but I don't think I ever did. That's how lame your pastor was as a kid growing up, I guess. I don't think I ever, ran away from home either, right? The best thing that I could come up with was when I was on at the National Youth Gathering, which you at my church would go to when you're in high school. We were in Denver, and I don't know what time curfew was, but we apparently weren't real excited about whatever time that was. And so after we were all supposed to be in our rooms, we had a coordinated effort where the whole youth group, and that was probably only like 10 people or so, we snuck out of the hotel and went walking through the streets of Denver through the middle of the night. It seemed like wherever we were at, we were more on the outskirts, so it wasn't that big a deal. No one got harmed. Not sure how long we were gone. We got back in, and no one found out, but I think someone got cold feet the next day and kind of ratted the whole group out, but I don't recall it being all that difficult of a situation. But I bring this up because as we're doing our sermon series on Genesis we're up to chapter 31, we're getting to the point where Jacob's ready to run away from home. Not ready to run away from a house literally, but the land of his father-in-law. But the problem is when you chose to kind of sneak out of the house to break a curfew, it was just you getting out. So it probably wasn't all that complicated, and if you're any good at it, you probably succeeded. But for Jacob, it's not that easy because Jacob, over the time that he's been with his father-in-law, he's acquired 2 wives and 2 maidservants, 12, well, at this point, 11 children, 12, because there's 1 daughter, so at least 12 kids. God has blessed him with a great number of even servants, camels, sheep, goats, all these different animals and so forth. And how exactly do you sneak away from home with all that without being noticed? That's where we're at in the story, and let's see how Jacob does with it. So we're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 31, and we're going to start here initially at verses 1 to 3. So Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything our father has owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude towards him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." So Laban was always kind of a jerk, if you will, to Jacob, always kind of taking advantage of Jacob, changing the terms on which, first of all, who Jacob was really trying to marry and who he's going to work for, and tricking him with that, and just changing his wages around. He was always manipulating and making life very difficult for Jacob. And so as long as he was successful in making life difficult for Jacob and gaining wealth for himself, he was nice to Jacob. It was probably a phony nice. But what's happened is, in the last few years now in the story, God has basically transferred all of the wealth from Laban over to Jacob. And Laban's kids aren't helping matters much. They're basically accusing Jacob of stealing their inheritance. So you have Laban, who had very little before Jacob showed up. God blessed Jacob, but it all belonged to his father-in-law. So Laban became very wealthy. And just when he's thinking he's going to be able to retire wealthy and just kind of live comfortably the last few years of his life, like a bad bet on the stock market, he's lost all through this business agreement with Jacob. And his attitudes changed to Jacob. And you know what it's like when you work for someone and their attitude changes to you, or you're friends with someone and their attitude changes to you. When someone's attitude changes to you that way, you don't really want to be around them. And so it's kind of amazing. I get amazed at watching the details of how God works. God doesn't want Jacob to stay in this land. This was not the land that was promised to Abraham. So Jacob's been made wealthy, but he doesn't want him to be comfortable in this land. So what does he do? He gets Laban to be really bitter and angry towards him, which is going to cause Jacob to not want to stay there anymore and to go back to the land in which he came from his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. And so God goes ahead and tells him, hey, it's time to go. The story picks up then Genesis 31, verses 4 to 9, and then I'm going to look at verses 14 to 16. So Jacob then, after God has told him he needs to go back to the land that he's from, he sends word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where the flocks were. And he said to them, I see that your father's attitude towards me is not what it has been before. But the God of my father has been with me, for you know that I've worked for your father with all of my strength. Yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 different times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked ones are going to be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to the streaked ones. So God has taken away your father's livestock, and he's given them to me. And then Rachel and Leah replied, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what he has paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. So go ahead and do what God has instructed you to do. Now, I have to tell you, as I constantly read all of these stories, it amazes me each chapter we look at just how in control God is of the details of these people's lives. He not only made Jacob wealthy, right, after his uncle or his father-in-law tried to take advantage of him and transfers all the wealth over, but he makes Jacob so he doesn't want to stay. But even in this situation, he's talking to his two wives, one whom he loved and one whom he was tricked into marrying, and basically said, your fathers treat me like garbage, and he's been unfair to me this whole time. God's told me to leave. Now, you would expect that they're not where Jacob comes from, they've never been. So you can't imagine that they would want to leave their friends, their family, where they grew up, what they knew, especially Leah. Leah wasn't loved by Jacob. He was forced into this marriage, tricked into this marriage with her. And so can you imagine how she must have felt when Jacob said, hey, I want to go back to the land of my fathers? Who would she have there? She's got a husband that doesn't really love her, and she won't have dad around anymore. She won't have all of the friends of the family and so forth. Not to mention you have Rachel and Leah, who up until this point are always competing with each other, right? You got one who can have kids and the other one who's having kids and rubbing it into her face. So then you have Rachel saying, well, then go and have kids with my servant. Then you have Leah saying, well, go and have my kids with my servant. So you got Jacob going from where he's supposed to have one wife to having two wives and two maidservants. And everything's a competition back and forth. So you would think that they would have a disagreement on leaving. But God works in such a way, God covers all the details, God covers all the angles, that these two ladies who are oftentimes competing and fighting with each other are like, yeah, let's go. Why do we want to be here with our father? We see how he's been treating us. And I'm just amazed at how God handles all those details, because you and I, we don't see God this way. When we read the Bible, we look back and say, wow, God really kind of crossed the T's and dotted the I's. But for some reason, when we go through life, we don't see that the God who did that in the Old Testament is still the God who does that in our lives. When we're going through the busyness of life, when we're going through the stress of finances and the strains of relationship and just all of the daily grind, we are oblivious to the fact that not only is God in control, but he doesn't really need our help. You know, one of the most quoted Bible passages is, God helps those who help themselves. And you know what? It's not a Bible passage. It's nowhere to be found in the Bible. And then you have those people who really trust in God. God is my pilot, but they think that God needs a co-pilot, and that should be us in our relationship with God, that he's the one that's going to be ultimately in charge, but I got to help him out. But the reality is God does not need your help. Your help will do nothing but probably get in the way and hinder what God wants to do. I was on vacation a couple weeks ago. The family, we had a chance to go kayaking on a lake in Wyoming called Jackson Lake, and it's in front of the Tetons, and it's a beautiful lake. And from where you rent the kayak, there's this island that they say you can go out to and paddle about a mile out to it. And they said you can pull your kayaks up on shore and just look around and everything. And so we did it. And as we got closer to the shore, it was very rocky, but that's perfect because my oldest daughter likes to look for rocks and so forth. And so we go and we paddle across the lake, and as we approach the bank it's really steep. It's not like gradual. It's just really steep. And not only is it really steep, but there's not a grain of sand on it. There probably is, but there's all these, fairly large size rocks that are lining this very steep bank. And you sit there and you're like, well, but how am I going to get the kayak up on that? And so I wasn't necessarily prepared for doing that, so I was in jeans and tennis shoes and whatever, but I'm like, oh, there's not going to be a graceful way of doing this. So I just got out of the kayak, and I happened to be in a two-person kayak and was able to do that without spilling, I guess Kim, who was in the back of it at that point, in that kayak. And then I pulled it far enough up on shore so that she could get out without getting wet. And Matthew was still in another kayak, and Caitlin and Megan were in another two-person kayak, and I knew I had to get all these kayaks up on shore. And so, you pull it up on these big rocks, and you think you got it far enough out of the water, and you let go, and it goes right back in the water, and it's like, this is going to be difficult. And so you bring it up even farther, and you let it go, and it just goes right back in the water. And it's big rocks that you're trying to walk on and pull on as you're doing this. So you're tripping and falling on these hot rocks, and you're pulling up, and every time you trip and fall, it slides back down. And it wasn't looking really good. And so whoever kayak I was on, they decided that they were going to try to help me to get that kayak up on the bank. But here's the deal. With big rocks like that, and no other place to put it other than this big rocky bank, the only way to get it to stay is to kind of pull it up and to angle it in such a way that somehow it kind of gets wedged in those rocks. And so, when they start helping, you think you might have gotten it to a spot, and then they push it, and it goes back down. So in my, very patient and calm demeanor that I always am, I finally just said, just stop, don't touch it, I don't need your help, right? And sure enough, when it was just me, it wasn't pretty looking, and I'm falling on the rocks as it's all happening, but I was able to get each kayak up eventually and wedge it in such a way that it didn't slide back down. I think that's how it is, with God, is we oftentimes look at God, and God's doing something, and God has a plan, and we're like, well, let me help you so I can get that house you want me to have. Or we look at God and say, let me help you to help me get that job that I know you really want me to have. Let me help with this. The reality is God does not need your help. When you try to help, you just bump the other end of the kayak and cause what he was just trying to do to just slide right back in. Time and time again, when we look at the account of Genesis, God is handling all the details, but the people that are involved don't realize he's doing it, and even if they think that he's doing it, they think they have to be doing their part. Now, I'm not telling you that you go through life just sitting on your backside and that God's going to make all your dreams come true. There is an element in which we cooperate, that we respond with the Almighty, but it can't be us thinking that somehow we help God to accomplish the plans in our lives. What we need to do is take what God plans in our lives and carry out what he said to do, rather than think that somehow we are accomplishing it or helping him with what it is he needs to do. The story then continues, verses 17 to 21 of chapter 31. So then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all of the livestock ahead of him, and along with the goods that he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac and in the land of Canaan. Now when Laban had gone to shear the sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him he was running away. And so he fled with all that he had, crossing the Euphrates River. and he headed to the hill country of Gilead. So God tells Jacob to leave, and Jacob has really two choices. He can go to father-in-law and say, Laban, it's been fun for 20 years. Actually, no, it really hasn't. And now I'm leaving. And I'm leaving with your daughters, with your grandkids, and, well, you're never going to see them again. And by the way, I'm taking everything that once belonged to you because it now belongs to me. He knew that that wasn't going to go over really well. And so he doesn't make the bravest decision, but he maybe makes the shrewdest decision. And it's certainly the one that I probably would have made, because why deal with the emotional drama and the conflict of being a man and telling Laban what it is you're going to do? Just go. Just take it and go. Let's get out of here. But there's a problem. Rachel, his beloved wife, where does this come from? Rachel, the wife that he really loves. She goes and takes her father's idols and false gods because she wants to have them on the trip. Now, it's hard to believe and it's hard to imagine that Isaac, the grandchild of Abraham, the one through whom Israel is made, through the sons of Isaac, some of them being then through Rachel, his beloved wife, that the mother of some of the tribes of Israel is one who worships and believes in false gods. Why, at this point, when she had seen what God had done through Jacob, as Jacob said, God has made me wealthy in spite of your father treating me wrong. God has told me to leave. Why is it that she still is holding on to these worthless idols and false gods? I can tell you what it's not. It's not that she's just trying to get rid of these and rescue her dad from these bad habits, kind of like, me and my brother used to do when we go fishing with my dad. My dad always had snuff, skull cans, those green skull cans. And we couldn't stand that he would always be doing that chew. And so this was like a ritual. Every time we'd go fishing, he'd leave his skull can somewhere there on the bank. And up in New York, there's a lot of these canals that you fish in that have really good fishing. And a canal up there is kind of like a river here. It's just, they're not real wide, but they're significant. And so we would take it. But part of the fun of stealing Dad's snuff can was you had to throw it a little bit upstream, right? Because in about 5 minutes, that little green skull can would come floating down the canal and be like, "Hey, Willie, look, it's a snuff fish." And we always called my dad by his first name. Willie would get very upset when he'd see his expensive can of snuff, right, floating down the canal. That's not what Rachel's doing to her dad Laban. She's not trying to spare him from his idolatry. She is idolatrous. She probably acknowledges and recognizes the God of Jacob, but she grew up with these other gods. She's going into a strange land. She's going into a foreign land, and she's not willing to let go of the idols of her past, because she's going to look to these idols to help her during this time of transition. She's going to look to these idols when she's in this unfamiliar land and things aren't going well. And I can't help, how many of us are holding on to some of the idols of our past, some of the bad things that we grew up on, that we relied on, that we trusted in, that when we get into uncertain and scary times, we bring those idols back, and they come back to haunt us. So Jacob heads off. He's got a 3-day head start, and you got Laban, who hears that Jacob's fled without saying goodbye, and who, as he's gathering his stuff to go out and chase him, maybe wants to have a prayer before the idols, right? And realizes they're gone. So he is mad. He is beyond ticked off, even to the point of ready to harm Jacob. He sets out in pursuit, but he's 3 days behind him. Well, it takes him about a week to catch up to where Jacob is. And as he's approaching where Jacob is, that night before he catches him, he goes to sleep, and God has a conversation with Laban. And God basically says this to Laban: be careful not to say anything to Jacob, good or bad. And that's kind of weird. You could hear and think of God as giving him a warning. Don't do anything to harm Jacob. But he says, don't say anything to Jacob, good or bad. Why? I don't know. It kind of reminds me of times when, as parents, we see one of our kids trying to solve a mess that they created, and even though they're trying to do good, we're like, just leave it alone. No, don't touch it. Just go away. Leave it alone. God does not want Laban to interfere in any way in Jacob's life, because even if Laban's trying to do something good, let's say Laban comes and says, I'm sorry for what I've done for the last 20 years. All that I have is yours. Just don't leave, and you can run the family business, and I'll keep out of your hair. That might be tempting to Jacob, especially because Jacob knows he's got a brother that's waiting to kill him when he gets back home. So God says, don't say anything good, don't say anything bad, don't say anything at all. The story picks up. Jacob, verse 25, had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him. And Laban and his relatives camped there too. So then Laban said to Jacob, what have you done? For you've deceived me. You've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you secretly deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so that I could send you away with joy, with the singing of music, with timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. Ouch. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to hurt you. But last night, the God of your father said to me, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. For now you have gone off because you have longed to return to your father's household. But why did you have to go ahead and steal my gods? Jacob answered Laban, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything here that belongs to you that I have. If so, take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So Jacob's like, father-in-law, you've been on my case for all this time. Go ahead and look. Have your way. See if anyone has your gods. If they do, they're dead. Laban says, well, thank you very much. And you know where he starts? He starts with Jacob's stuff. And he looks through Jacob's stuff because Jacob's the son-in-law. Jacob's not trusted and he's not loved for all that has gone on. He's taken his daughters away. Jacob didn't have it. Then he goes to Leah's stuff. And it's kind of interesting, the order in which he goes, that Leah gets picked on next. Leah's going to do this because Leah's going to get back at me because I tricked Jacob into marrying Leah, and Leah doesn't like the fact that Jacob doesn't really love her, and she blames me for it. Leah's got to have him. Leah doesn't have him. Well, if it's not Leah and it's not Jacob, it's got to be the women servants, the maid servants. Wasn't them. And then that basically leaves just Rachel, and Laban probably doesn't believe that it could be Rachel, but there's really no one else to check. And so Rachel, seeing all of this potential avalanche, this potential wave of death that's going to come her way when it's discovered that she stole the false gods. So as dad is checking Jacob's tent and Leah's tent and the maidservant's tent, Rachel goes and she takes those gods and puts them in the saddle of her camel, and then she sits on it. So dad goes through Rachel's stuff, can't find it, and now he heads over to check on the saddle of his daughter's camel, and Rachel's on it, and she says, forgive me, Dad, but I'm having my period. And listen, guys, you know what I'm talking about. Your daughter says that, you're like, oh, too much information. All right, just don't get up, just stay where you are. And so she's allowed then to trick her dad, who then never realizes that the idols are on in the saddlebags of her camel. And now Jacob's ticked off because Laban has chased him through the desert like somehow he's a criminal, accused him of stealing his gods, has not found any, and he lectures Laban about the fact that you've mistreated me for 20 years, you've accused me of this, and what do you have to show for it? And Laban's in the presence of all the extended family, and he's feeling kind of sheepish about it because he knows it's true. He didn't find the gods, and so he just says, all right, you guys can go. But before you go, we got to do this little agreement thing, because here's the deal. Laban was scared that that when Jacob got home, and if Dad was still alive, if he told Dad, if he told brother, if he told aunts and uncles and the extended family, and found out how Laban had treated him, that they're going to come back and they're going to do some not so good things to Laban and to his family. So Laban insists that they make a treaty. They put a rock there to recognize the treaty, that Laban will never cross over this area, and that Jacob and his family will never come back and execute revenge on Laban. And they end up having a good old-fashioned Texas barbecue. They go to bed that night, and then in the morning, Dad and Grandpa gives proper goodbyes, hugs, kisses, and they go on their way. This was certainly a trying time for Jacob, who didn't know how this was going to turn out, but I'm here to tell you this is minuscule to what you're going to hear next week, what he's really worried about, because as I mentioned earlier, he's about to go home, where when he left 20 years ago, brother was ready to kill him, and he doesn't know if it's going to be the same. He doesn't know if he's going to be killed, his wives are going to be killed, his children will be killed as he heads back, and so that's going to be a really interesting story next week as we look at it. But before I close the message this morning, I want to say this. You know, all of us in here have probably had questions that we would like to ask God. I mean, some of you probably want to know, why did God create evil? Or why did he allow Satan in the world? Why did God allow this bad thing to happen or that bad thing to happen? I normally, and for the most part, I don't have questions about God. There's a lot of things I don't understand. There's a whole lot of things I don't like, but I know that it's right regardless of how it is, because God is right, and so it doesn't really matter to me. But I have to tell you, when I was working with this text, I couldn't help but think, why did God allow Rachel to get away with idolatry? Jacob, rightly so, said, whoever has these false idols is going to die. God, throughout the history of Israel, is always trying to keep the idols out, that anyone who breaks the first commandment, whoever has false gods, the punishment is death. And so it's one thing when God sees his children lie to another person, or maybe even steal something. I mean, these are offenses, these are sins, and these are wrong. But the greatest of all sins, that is idolatry, is the most personal sin to God, that someone would hold on and trust and believe in other gods before him. There is no more personal sin. There is no more greater sin, yet God allows it to go unpunished. Why? I'm curious as to why he did, because it's not that way throughout the rest of the history of Israel. I think I might kind of understand the answer, but who really knows? The reality is when God made the covenant with Jacob, when he was heading to Laban's family to get his wives, what he thought was a wife, he made the promise to God, if you will make me successful in my journey, if you'll bless me, if you'll enrich me, you'll be my God and I'll be your person. Rachel is his favorite wife. If God allows Laban to find out if Rachel is put to death, as Jacob said it would be the case if she did, I can't help but wonder if Jacob's faith was so weak, he would have really struggled with recovering from that. But that's just speculation. But this is fact, that God is a God of wrath and God is a God of punishment, but his wrath and his punishment is so rare. His ability to forgive, to even forgive the most personal offense when someone is holding on to idols and false gods before him. God, in accomplishing his will, in creating the people of Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel, his purpose is on doing that he is able to separate, to set aside, to not take personally this great sin. I don't think there's one of us who can set aside close to something like that when someone personally sins against us. But yet our God does. He is slow to anger. He abounds in love. And for that, we should all be thankful. Would you join me in a word of prayer? Gracious Almighty God, we thank and praise you for your word. We thank and praise you that your hand works in our lives, even though we're not able to recognize it. Help us to trust you, gracious God. Help us to not work against you unintentionally by thinking that you need our help to accomplish things. But by faith, gracious God, may we follow as you direct us. In Jesus' name, amen.